never slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. I don't ever slow up, no I don't take shit. I got no love for the fakeness. If you wanna play tough and wanna hate this, I'll always show up and make a statement. Everything I do so instinctive.
Dr. Sidney Gottlieb was the chief chemist for the United States Central Intelligence Agency. He managed a project vital to national security. In government laboratories, universities, prisons, cabarets, and secret sites, which they called black sites worldwide, the CIA was experimenting with the effects of various conditions on the human mind. Their goal was to find the best methods of mind control and apply them as tools for espionage and warfare. However, the human mind is not so easily controlled. First, it must be emptied. For over 10 years, the CIA used thousands of men, women, and children as unwitting mind control test subjects. Prolonged exposure to psychoactive drugs, torture, sleep deprivation, hypnosis, and psychological punishment were only some of the experiments conducted. Many documents related to Project MKULTRA were destroyed, but not all of them. For years, people have been piecing this story together. In this process, they discovered hundreds of terrifying experiments, the cover-up of a CIA officer's murder, and the roots of the countercultural revolution. This movement, shaped by LSD, was also illuminated. But many questions remain. Who was behind MKUltra? Why was the CIA interested in mind control? And perhaps most importantly, what were the results? In 1942, the U.S. established the Office of Strategic Services, the country's first foreign intelligence agency, responsible for espionage operations in World War II. However, in 1945, after defeating the Axis powers, President Harry Truman disbanded the office. He believed the U.S. had no need for such a foreign intelligence organization, especially in peacetime. But the war had never truly ended. Only the enemy had changed. 2 years later, the Soviet Union was spreading communism across Europe and building nuclear bombs. The Cold War was at its peak, so in 1947, President Truman signed the National Security Act. This act created the Central Intelligence Agency with a vague definition. Its purpose was to carry out intelligence-related duties that affected national security, using, as they put it, all appropriate methods. The CIA began spying on suspected communists, interfering in European elections, and gathering intelligence on the growing Soviet military. For an intelligence agency, this was not unusual, but this situation did not last. In 1949, a Catholic Church cardinal in then-Soviet Hungary was accused of attempting to start World War III, revive the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and crown himself emperor. These charges were outlandish and seemed to have no basis. But in court, the cardinal appeared out of control. He looked dazed, answered everything in a robotic tone, and eventually publicly confessed to all the accusations. When the CIA realized this, they came to a disturbing conclusion. The Soviets had found a way to force people to say things they didn't believe. In other words, they could control people's minds. Mind control had previously only existed in science fiction stories. But if it was real, the U.S. faced an existential threat. With mind control, the Soviets could force captured agents to reveal secrets, turn against the U.S., and even brainwash American citizens into becoming communists. The first country to widely employ mind control would rule the world. In 1950, a former intelligence officer named Allen Dulles joined the CIA. Dulles believed they had to take action themselves and learn the secrets of mind control. Therefore, he launched the first CIA mind control program named Bluebird. In a network of secret prisons, or black sites, in West Germany and Japan, the CIA began using captured Soviet prisoners as test subjects for their new, special interrogation methods. They also directly collaborated with former Nazi scientists and the notorious director of Japan's Unit 731. In its initial stages, the results of Project Bluebird seemed disappointing. It appeared that no particular interrogation method was sufficient to reprogram someone's mind. Dulles knew he had to expand Bluebird, but he needed a unique and rare individual to help him. Someone intelligent, visionary, and courageous enough to lead the most ambitious, and perhaps most diabolical, scientific project in history. And he knew only one person with these qualities: Sidney Gottlieb. Sidney Gottlieb was born with club feet. After 3 major surgeries, he could finally walk, albeit with a limp and great difficulty. Despite his disability, he excelled academically in every group he was in. He studied mathematics and physics at City College of New York, chemistry at the University of Wisconsin, and received his Ph.D. in biochemistry from Caltech. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Gottlieb applied to join the Army but was rejected due to his disability. He had to serve his country in another way. During the war, Gottlieb worked for several government organizations, researching everything from soil chemistry to fungal metabolism. In 1951, the CIA offered him a job in the technical services staff, which developed espionage devices. Gottlieb became the head of the new chemistry division. He was a creative and dedicated researcher and had attracted significant attention. Around the same time, Allen Dulles decided to expand Project Bluebird. He renamed it Artichoke and put the technical services staff in charge of the project, effectively making Gottlieb its primary leader. Gottlieb believed that mind control was essentially a 2-step process. First, the mind had to be emptied, then filled with something else. But this was not easy at all. Isolation, electric shock, sleep deprivation, and other methods were too harsh. Instead of emptying the individual's mind, they destroyed it, leaving nothing to fill. Gottlieb needed a more sophisticated solution than the usual CIA interrogation methods. As a chemist, he was naturally interested in drugs. In the first stage, he began his experiments with marijuana, which made his subjects burst into uncontrollable laughter. With cocaine, their behavior became erratic and uncontrollable. Heroin was no better, and the effects of a psychedelic substance called mescaline were completely unpredictable. But there was another option. A few years earlier, the U.S. Army had been researching innovative chemical weapons, one of which was a hallucinogen called LSD-25, developed in Switzerland. This substance had interesting psychological effects on humans. When Gottlieb learned of these experiments, he became so curious that he decided to try LSD himself. The experience was very enlightening for him, and he believed that LSD was the key to human mind control. However, CIA intelligence indicated that the Soviets had already discovered LSD and were able to produce it. If this was indeed the key to mind control, the U.S. was significantly behind and needed to catch up quickly. In response, Gottlieb initiated a wave of LSD experiments under Project Artichoke. Initially, their experiments were conducted on volunteer CIA agents, but eventually, they moved on to Korean War prisoners of war and psychiatric hospital patients whom the CIA called expendables or something disposable. Gottlieb's experiments led to interesting discoveries about LSD, but raised more questions than answers. Project Artichoke was not ambitious enough. They had to go beyond the current level of assault again. In 1953, Dwight D. Eisenhower became U.S. President and appointed the then director of the CIA as his chief of staff. His replacement was Allen Dulles. Dulles understood that mind control research was of vital importance to national security. When Gottlieb told him he needed to expand Project Artichoke, he gave him his full support. On April 13, 1953, Dulles officially launched Project MKULTRA. This project was the most secretive and terrifying operation in CIA history. Projects Bluebird and Artichoke were considered rudimentary research compared to MKUltra. To uncover the secrets of mind control, Gottlieb was determined to test every possible material and method on volunteers and non-volunteers, both inside and outside the U.S., no matter how brutal and cruel these projects seemed. To keep Project MKUltra secret, most people didn't even know it existed. Gottlieb divided Project MKULTR into independent sub-projects, each delegated to others and overseen remotely. Within a few years, the number of these sub-projects reached 149, but only Gottlieb and one other person knew about all of them. Sub-projects 1 and 2 focused on the CIA's initial mind control approaches, creating a truth serum that would prevent someone from lying under its influence and studying the effect of drugs on behavior modification. But for the rest of the sub-projects, Gottlieb was free to approach the problem in any way he wished. First and foremost, he was interested in LSD, in Sub-Project 3. Gottlieb wanted to understand the effects of this substance on ordinary people. So, one of the first test sites specifically built for Project MKUltra was completely in plain sight but hidden. One of the CIA's simplest methods was to lure drug addicts, small-time criminals, and homeless people to an apartment in New York, give them LSD-laced drinks, and monitor their behavior. In Sub-Project 4, Gottlieb hired a famous magician to teach CIA agents sleight-of-hand techniques so they could administer whatever they wanted to their subjects without them realizing it. For Sub-Project 5, he allocated a specific budget to an experiment at the University of Minnesota aimed at studying the relationship between memory and hypnosis. However, as Gottlieb planned more sub-projects, he ran into a problem. At that time, only one laboratory in Switzerland knew how to make LSD. But this had caused so much trouble between the Soviets and the CIA that they decided to stop production. To secure supplies, the CIA spent $240,000 to buy their last 10 grams, which was roughly equivalent to 2 sheets of ordinary paper. This was practically the entire world's supply of LSD. Gottlieb used most of it for further experiments, but kept a small amount for MKULTRA Sub-Project 6, where the CIA secretly paid the pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly to reverse engineer it and develop its own method for mass-producing LSD. It wasn't long before they implemented this program. Now, with a seemingly unlimited supply, Gottlieb was free to investigate the question that had always interested him. How much LSD can a person consume before their mind is practically destroyed? Gottlieb defined 3 sub-projects to get the answer to this question. In one of them, 7 patients, most of them young, received double, triple, and even quadruple doses of LSD every day for 72 weeks. All of this happened at the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, at the Federal Penitentiary in Atlanta, and even at a juvenile detention center in New Jersey. Gottlieb also started 4 other sub-projects. In one experiment, 20 prisoners were given LSD almost every day for 15 months. In the same way, the number of sub-projects under Gottlieb's control also grew larger and more brutal. The global death toll of MKUltra steadily increased, and even those who survived rarely recovered from its severe psychological torture. From this point on, it was only a matter of time before someone with too much information made a fatal mistake and wanted to leave or escape Project MKUltra. Frank Olson had joined the CIA's technical services staff a few months before the start of Project MKULTR. Before this, he was the head of the Army's Special Operations Division, the same division that introduced Sidney Gottlieb to LSD. Olson was a chemist. But after all these years, he found the sheer volume of inhumane projects impossible to tolerate. In late 1953, Olson visited a secret CIA facility in Stuttgart, Germany. He had gone there to oversee special interrogations in which prisoners were dying from the very poisons he had created. After this incident, one of Olson's ex-colleagues sent a report to his superiors stating that Olson was deeply disturbed by what he had seen in Germany and seemed unwilling to keep what he had witnessed a secret. In early November, Olson returned to the U.S. and received an invitation to a CIA gathering with Sidney Gottlieb and 7 other MKULTRA members. During this seemingly friendly gathering, Gottlieb opened a bottle of Cointreau. The bottle was laced with LSD, and Olson did not react well after drinking it. He refused to eat or even talk to his family. A few words he did say were, "I've made a terrible mistake." A few days later, Gottlieb persuaded him to speak with a CIA psychiatrist in New York. On the way there, he still wasn't eating. But when he spoke with the psychiatrist, he seemed to calm down somewhat. Olson had promised his wife he would be home for Thanksgiving dinner to be with his family. But on the way back from New York, he had another nervous breakdown. He said he was ashamed to see his family. He thought the police were after him and felt a terrible sense of helplessness. Olson's MKULTRA colleague suggested he see the psychiatrist in New York again. The psychiatrist spent about an hour with Olson and then 20 minutes alone with Robert Lashbrook, the only person besides Gottlieb who knew everything about Project MKUltra. The psychiatrist told Olson that he should agree to be voluntarily hospitalized, and he accepted. In fact, he even told Lashbrook that he had been waiting for free time to meditate for a long time. That night, Olson and Lashbrook were in a room on the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel in New York. At 2:25 a.m., the window broke and Olson fell to the sidewalk below. The hotel manager immediately ran outside. Olson had survived the fall. According to the manager, he lifted his head slightly, tried to speak, but then fell back down. Before the police arrived, Lashbrook made 2 short calls, first to Gottlieb, asking him to send someone to manage the crisis, and then to a number belonging to the MKUltra psychiatrist. At a time when calls were manually connected, it was common for operators to listen in on conversations, and these calls were short. The police entered Lashbrook's room with their weapons drawn. They found him on the toilet. According to Lashbrook, Olson was an army chemist who had come to New York for psychiatric treatment. He had become mentally unstable and jumped out of the hotel window. The story fit the evidence, and Lashbrook added that all of this had to be kept secret for national security. When the CIA crisis manager arrived, he orchestrated a 3-step plan to prevent Olson's death from being linked to the CIIR project MKULTR. First, they would convince the New York police not to investigate further and mislead the media. Second, they gave Lashbrook a precise narrative to prevent discrepancies from appearing. Finally, they would inform Olson's family and keep them calm and cooperative. The first 2 steps were easy, but the third was another story. The official narrative was that Frank Olson had either fallen or jumped from the hotel window. But since the window was closed and curtained, the possibility of it being accidental seemed low, and jumping required considerable agility. Olson would have had to run from the back of the room, jump over the radiator, break the window, and contort himself to avoid hitting the separator. If he wanted to jump out, he could have easily opened the window and stepped out. At Olson's funeral, Gottlieb told his family that they could ask any questions they had about everything that happened whenever they wanted. But at that time, they had no choice but to accept his words. Frank Olson had either fallen or jumped from the hotel window. These 2 words, fallen or jumped, kept swirling in the mind of Olson's 9-year-old son, Eric. They had completely different meanings. But despite his young age, he felt that neither was true. In fact, the CIA had omitted a crucial detail. Frank Olson was an unwitting human subject in an LSD experiment. And years later, this became a fatal mistake for Sidney Gottlieb. With the growing fear of war with the Soviet Union among the American public, Sidney solidified his power in the CIA and drastically expanded the scope of Project MKUltra. By the mid-1950s, Gottlieb was funding dozens of sub-projects at the country's most prestigious universities and hospitals, none of which knew that the CIA was behind the funding. MKUltra was so vast that it included everything from the effects of extreme sensory deprivation and isolation to a type of truth serum and a pill that would sober up a drunk person. But in reality, these initial experiments did not make much progress in mind control. So Gottlieb took it a step further. In 1955, the CIA contacted a man named Donald Ewan Cameron. He was the president of the largest psychiatric associations in the U.S. and Canada and the head of the psychiatry department at McGill University. Cameron had recently conducted an experiment that greatly interested the CIA. He called his method psychic driving, a way to treat minor disorders like anxiety or depression. First, Cameron would put his patient into a semi-comatose state with drugs, which could last anywhere from 10 days to 3 months. Then, he would use electric shock up to 40 times stronger than the usual amount. He would place his patient in solitary confinement, give them very little food and water, administer large amounts of LSD, and equip them with a special helmet with headphones. Sentences like, "My mother hates me," would be repeated over and over hundreds of thousands of times. And after a few days in this state, he would put them to sleep for another 10 days. Gottlieb saw great potential in Cameron's research, so he began funding it under MKULTRA Subproject 68. Cameron's work for the CIA was even more innovative. But decades later, a review showed that it had no therapeutic benefit whatsoever. In 1955, the man responsible for drugging people in the New York apartment was transferred to his regular job in San Francisco. This was a vital part of Project MKULTRA. So, instead of halting the operation, Gottlieb made the project stranger. Sub-Project 42, also known as Operation Midnight Climax, had 2 goals. Just like in New York, the CIA intended to experiment with drugs on ordinary citizens. But this time, they added a new variable. From late 1955, the CIA sent a full team of prostitutes onto the streets of San Francisco. For every customer they brought to an apartment, they would have relations with them and drug them, receiving between $50 and $100. The CIA filmed and recorded everything from behind a one-way mirror. According to one agent, there were so many hidden electronic devices in the apartment that if a drop of water fell, there was a chance of electrocution. Operation Midnight Climax did not reveal much about mind control. But strangely, the combination of sex and drugs proved to be one of the most effective methods of information extraction in all of Project MKUltra. Of course, research was not always the priority. Gottlieb and his team were not entirely opposed to the revelry of running a brothel. After 4 years, MKUltra had become a massive project with dozens of sub-projects running concurrently worldwide. But managing it put a lot of pressure on Gottlieb. So in 1957, he decided to go to Germany and train as a field agent. Of course, the CIA has not released any information about his time there, and it remains confidential. But 50 years later, a website revealed that during that time, the CIA was arresting individuals without the knowledge of German authorities and sometimes imprisoning them for months, implementing interrogation methods on them that were forbidden under German law. After 2 years of living abroad, Gottlieb returned to Project MKUltra with no specific changes implemented. The CIA had tried every possible drug and psychological technique. In this process, they had found thousands of cruel methods to break the mind, but not a single way to control it. Regarding LSD, Gottlieb concluded that its effects were too unpredictable. But by then, it was too late. By 1960, the CIA had spread so much LSD in the U.S. that it went from university professors to students and then to the general public. Interestingly, instead of controlling people, LSD seemed to make them discover their true selves and break free from conventional frameworks. Ultimately, LSD became one of the main reasons for the countercultural movement of the 1960s and 70s. With LSD spreading worldwide, Project MKUltra could not remain secret for long. In 1961, Alan Dulles resigned as Director of Central Intelligence and was replaced by John McCone. MKUltra was past its peak, but it was still the agency's most confidential project. McCone wanted to understand what was going on. Gottlieb managed to curb his curiosity and prevent him from learning anything about MKUltra, while he himself launched several more sub-projects. One of these projects involved giving 36,000 micrograms of LSD to a filmmaker, and the result was disastrous. Nevertheless, after 2 years of leading the CIA, McCone gradually became suspicious of Project MKUltra and requested a report on it. Most of the details were redacted, but the report had 4 main points. MKUltra was unethical, illegal, against the rights and interests of the American people, and the disclosure of its details would severely damage the CIA's reputation. The conclusion was that the scope of MKUltra should be reduced. But Gottlieb, strangely, went even further. In the preceding years, the CIS assumption about the Soviets' ability to control minds had turned out to be completely wrong. Mind control, as it turned out, was nothing more than a fantasy. Therefore, other than creating a few new special interrogation methods, Project MKUltra was a complete failure. After 10 years, Gottlieb decided to practically abandon the project, and none of the remaining sub-projects were renewed. John McCone resigned from the CIA in 1965. His successor lasted less than a year and was replaced by Richard Helms, who played a significant role in Project MKUltra. One of Helms' first actions was to appoint Gottlieb as head of the newly renamed Technical Services Staff. Gottlieb performed very well in his new role. In these 7 years, he was involved in the development of various practical tools, from a pistol the size of a finger to miniature cameras, poisons, and even a cat surgically equipped with a microphone and transmitter. Gottlieb was irreplaceable to the CIA, and under Richard Helms' management, Project MKUltra seemed to have become a distant, forgotten memory. On June 17, 1972, Washington, D.C. police arrested several men who were wiretapping phones and stealing documents from the Democratic National Committee, headquarters in the Watergate complex. Aside from using equipment from Gottlieb's technical services staff, these infiltrations were linked to President Richard Nixon's election campaign. Nixon asked Helms to create a cover-up, but Helms refused. A few months later, Nixon fired him. So the guardian of MKUltra was no longer in his post. On his last day of work, Helms asked Gottlieb to destroy all documents related to MKUltra, and this decision was perfectly timed. The next director of Central Intelligence, James Schlesinger, was determined to clean up all corruption from the CIA. He immediately fired Gottlieb and asked all current and former CIA employees to report any illegal activities the CIA had ever conducted. But 2 days later, President Nixon appointed Schlesinger as Secretary of Defense, and the new director, William Colby, received the report Schlesinger had requested. Despite the importance of the 693 pages Colby received, the CIA's illegal activities remained secret. However, somehow, this information leaked out. A few months after Nixon's resignation in 1974, the New York Times published a report on the CIA's illegal espionage against members of the anti-war movement. The next U.S. President, Gerald Ford, was forced to initiate an investigation. The Rockefeller Commission, as it became known, focused primarily on the CIA's illegal espionage against American citizens. During 6 months of hearings, MKULTRA was never mentioned by name, but some of its activities were discussed. In June 1975, the Commission released its final report. The next day, the Washington Post published 4 related reports. One of those reports told the story of an Army scientist who was unknowingly given LSD. He then developed severe symptoms and fell from the 10th floor window of a New York hotel. When Eric Olson read this story, he immediately understood they were talking about his father. But some details were wrong. Frank Olson worked for the CIA and had fallen from the 13th floor, but the CIA had never said he was drugged. So the Olson family immediately sought a skilled lawyer. This lawsuit, under the name NERA, forced the CIA to reveal scandalous documents about Project MKUltra. Instead, President Ford issued a formal apology and offered the family $750,000 to close the case and not pursue it further. After some thought, they accepted. The official narrative had changed. It was said that Frank Olson had jumped from that window after a bad experience with LSD. But his son Eric, now 31, still felt there was more to the story. His life's goal had now become finding the truth and understanding what truly happened to his father. Throughout his career, Sidney Gottlieb was one of the most unknown individuals in the CIA. Even at the highest levels of the White House, many were unaware of his existence. Now, the government was investigating his activities. In 1975, Gottlieb had to testify before the Church Committee a new round of investigations. He was granted legal responsibility and was allowed to speak behind closed doors under an alias. But in 4.5 hours of testimony, he only revealed very superficial details about his time working. By the time the Church Committee submitted its final report, Project MKUltra and Sidney were still shrouded in mystery. But this situation was about to change. In 1977, a researcher named John Marks requested any documents and records that might have survived and not been destroyed from Project MKUltra. Under the Freedom of Information Act, the agency was obliged to cooperate with this request. This was the beginning of Gottlieb's downfall. Years earlier, Gottlieb had forgotten to destroy the financial records of Project MKUltra. When Marks made his request, he received over 16,000 pages of documents, some of which he released at a press conference. Although they were only financial reports, they revealed real details about MKUltra. Gottlieb's name was all over these reports. He was summoned again to testify for further explanations, this time before the U.S. Senate. But as before, Gottlieb skillfully evaded the facts. He never said that he was the director of MKULTRA, that the CIA had deirrigation centers outside the U.S., or that any of his test subjects had actually died. In the committee's view, MKUltra was a rogue scientific project, not a global operation with catastrophic consequences. But Marks was not satisfied with these answers. He dedicated 2 years to investigating all the details related to MKUltra and published a book in 1979 detailing everything he had found. The book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, revealed the horrifying truth of MKULTRA in a way no Senate hearing or government report had done before. The book meticulously described the CIA Haskrula experiments on prisoners, psychiatric patients, and even children in a futile search for mind control. For the first time, the American people were confronted with the full story of MKUltra and the people behind it. Public trust in the CIA reached an all-time low. The book presented a complex picture of Sidney Gottlieb, whose undeniable scientific genius was no less than his extreme cruelty. After the book's publication, Gottlieb's name was never forgotten. But according to all reports, he lived a comfortable life in retirement. Gottlieb experienced a calm and pleasant family life. He was very religious and fully immersed himself in his surrounding community. Ultimately, a particular part of his work at the CIA came back to haunt him. At Frank Olson's funeral, Gottlieb had told the Olson family that he would answer any questions they had about what happened to their father. Olson's children, 31 years later, in 1984, took him up on this offer. Gottlieb only repeated what they already knew. He said their father had been given LSD and had either fallen or jumped from the hotel window. His response to their tougher and more critical questions was that he had moved past those days and did not want to revisit those memories. When Eric Olson insisted and pressed further, Gottlieb told him that he was clearly still troubled by his father's death and suggested he join a support group. This remark was very disturbing to Eric, and at that moment he decided to prove that his father's death was not accidental. Eric waited 10 years until his mother passed away and then decided to exhume his father's body. He hired a forensic pathologist to examine his father's body for a month. Frank Olson's body was free of toxins, but no pieces of glass were found on his father's head or neck, which should have been there if he had jumped from the window. But interestingly, Olson had fallen on his back, but a part of his skull above his left eye was fractured. 3 years later, in 1997, the CIA released a training manual titled A Study in Assassination, written in the 1950s, the same year Olson had died. It was the same year Olson was pushed out the window. The manual was unsigned, but Gottlieb was identified as the author. The manual described a simple method of assassination that would raise little suspicion. First, the victim would be unconscious, preferably with a blow to the temple without leaving any visible wounds. Then, they would have to fall from at least 23 meters onto a hard surface. To Eric Olson, this sounded very familiar. In 1999, the New York District Attorney began investigating Frank Olson's murder by Gottlieb. At that time, Gottlieb was 80 years old and had a mild heart condition. Gottlieb died before he could be tried, and his body was cremated. His wife refused to disclose the cause of his death. But Eric Olson believed that Sidney Gottlieb had taken his own life and taken all the secrets with him to the grave. If yesterday they used LSD and electric shock for mind control, today the world has changed. Now the main tools of mind manipulation are not injections and pills, not classical hypnosis, but data and algorithms. One only needs to look at systems like targeted advertising, social media algorithms, information filter bubbles, and the use of behavioral psychology in app design. All of these cause our behavior and beliefs to change without us realizing it. Some call this system digital mind control. For example, when an app continuously and with intelligent algorithms shows you content that matches your previous beliefs, it makes you sink deeper into that belief, and even the ability to analyze different realities is lost. This is a type of cognitive engineering. Without drugs, without shock, without injections, but with the same effect or perhaps even greater. In the world of technology, Project Neuralink, introduced by Elon Musk, has caused quite a stir. The project's goal is to implant chips in the brain so that humans can directly communicate with digital devices. The ideas are interesting, such as downloading new languages into the brain or transmitting emotions. But the concerns are also serious. If a system can send information to the brain, it can also manipulate information. Many have raised the question of brain security against hacking. What if one day a hacker could delete or add a memory to your brain? These questions may seem like science fiction now. But if MKULTRA has taught us anything, It is that governments are willing to cross ethical boundaries to achieve their goals, especially if no one finds out.